Hello everyone, welcome. I'm Sonal Desai, Professor at NCAER and Center Director for National Data Innovation Center. I also hold a joint appointment as Professor of Sociology at University of Maryland. NCAER set up the NDIC, National Data Innovation Center, in order to strengthen India's data ecosystem. And these seminars are a part of our effort at creating a community of data collectors and users. Our goal is to examine emerging trends in global discourse around data and to also look at them in the context of Indian experience. My colleague and NDIC Deputy Director Santanu Pramanik and I welcome you to this fascinating seminar. Today we are privileged to have Professor Frauke Kreuter. Professor Kreuter co-founded and co-directs the data science centers at University of Maryland and University of Mannheim in Germany. She's an elected fellow of American Statistical Association and also an award winner, Foxy Award winner for American Association of Public Opinion Research. She has been looking into a variety of different ways of collecting data and collating them. She led a very interesting Facebook study that you have been seeing results out of. So we look forward to hearing from Frauke Kreuter. We also have two very interesting commentators. Professor James is the director and professor at International Institute for Population Sciences in Mumbai. As you all know, IIPS is one of the largest data collection, analysis, and training organizations in the country. In fact, not having attended IIPS, I always feel a little bit disadvantaged that I have somehow missed out on the fellowship of demographers in India. He has published widely on demographic transition and demographic dividend in India. Our second commentator is Soumya Bhaduri, who is a macroeconomist, and he's currently working with the Strategic Research Unit at Reserve Bank of India. He has done some very interesting research on linking nightlights data to macroeconomic trends, and we thought he would bring a very interesting and different perspective to this discussion. So thank you everyone for joining me. We are looking forward to a presentation and rich discussion. These seminars are also open to anyone, particularly students. So if for the listeners, if in future you would like to suggest to your students or younger colleagues to participate in it, please do. Thank you. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Frauke.
Thank you, Sonali. This is a true pleasure. I was saying it's too bad I can't meet everybody in person, but I think the advantage, as you just said, with the virtual format is that we probably can have an even larger audience and a lot of students can participate for whom travel might be a challenge. So I welcome you all and I want to encourage you to get in touch afterwards with any questions you might have or follow up. And I very much look forward to the discussion we're having here. As Sonali said, and Santanu alluded to that too, there's a lot of discussion going on worldwide on how to change data collection. And I want to contribute a little bit to talking about combining data from multiple sources. Not necessarily your traditional record linkage talk, but more sort of a larger perspective on how to think about some of the potentials and challenges in data linkage. I have three parts to this talk. I want to get us started with a motivation on sort of challenges in the current data production. And I have to admit my perspective on that is very much driven by what I've seen in Europe and the US, and I'm very curious to hear if the challenges are different or the discussions are different in India. I will briefly introduce exciting developments in the US with respect to alternative data sources, both renewed or novel access to administrative data, but also new forms of measurement, both in terms of new devices and new use of platforms. Sonali mentioned that earlier, we have been leveraging the Facebook platform for data collection quite extensively. In the second part of the talk, I will sort of try to become a bit more conceptual and talk about how, in order to make proper use of the multiple data sources, we really need to think about the research questions we're having. And I will showcase some of the sort of potential for this combination using a study that we've done in Germany with the Institute for Employment Research. And then in the third part, certainly something for discussion, also hearing what work the discussants do, sort of the notion or possible risks that come with maybe, how should I say, differential data quality of the various sources. So let's look at the challenges in production at the beginning. And some of you might be familiar with the Pew Research Center in the US. They also have a pretty strong international arm. And in the US, they have been for years and are still a quite respectable source for telephone surveys. And they have this nice graph here that shows their response rates, even in phone surveys, falling quite dramatically. And, in the US at least, the face-to-face rates fall similarly elevated up because they started out higher. In Germany, we were never as high as the US was with the face-to-face rates, but the trends are pretty similar. This paired with the fact that the data collection costs have been rising, increasing contact attempts and the like, make everybody nervous for about a decade, it feels like, at least. And the call was out to find ways to use alternative data sources in the production of both research statistic, but also the federal statistical system in the US. What you see here on the right, that picture, is a study from a consensus report that is available for free from the national academies in the US. You can search for it and download this report and the second volume of this report if you want to see the details. Some of what I'm telling here is captured in there. There's also a new document that just came out from the Data Foundation on Modernizing the US Data Infrastructure. Nancy Potok, the former chief statistician of the United States, was co-author of this document and alluding to the new federal data strategy. The hope here is, or the push quite heavily, is that process data, as they come out of regular actions of any administration, are made available for further use beyond the task activity of the administration, and ideally for research. We see a similar movement, and have seen this actually maybe a decade earlier in Germany. For those of you maybe who know German, this is sort of the Social Security claim record. It looks just like any form all over the world, just different characters. But we can look back to that at the very end because someone has to fill in that form, and likely there might be errors attached to it. But that's not for now. The other element that has happened, which I find quite exciting, is that not just electronic forms as they or data that appear anyway electronically are available increasingly, but also data that come from old processes, such like the ones depicted here on the right, which come from the former GDR, East Germany, complaint letters sent to administrations, and those things are right now scanned in and analyzed and digitized, and so in a form administrative processes that are made available for research. The biggest obstacle to using these data and to combine them with other data sources has been and still is security of the records. And I've been fortunate to be part of the CoreRich initiative for the last 5 years or so, where we developed a FedRAMP secured entity that runs on the Amazon cloud, but could be any cloud provider, where data can be ingested and analyzed, combined, and there's a pretty sophisticated data stewardship model that governs the access and the workflow and makes sure that products that go out fulfill privacy requirements, something I'll come back to later on as well. A lot of city, state, county, and federal agencies have been using this kind of environment and were comfortable sharing data in the environment. And, you know, since we're talking about linkage, one of the big legal challenges we have in the US, but also in Germany, is that certain agencies are not allowed to share the data directly with each other. So they need a third-party place, if you will, in the research project that then creates the proper legal environment with which research work can be done that allows the combination of, say, employment records with records from the criminal justice system, or, you know, you name it. And so those kind of combined research projects were possible, or are now possible, in this call-rich environment. The other new development is that when we think of combining data sources, it's not just administrative data and maybe survey data, but also data from other forms of digital traces. The term digital traces is one I like because, you know, we have a lot of digital devices and interact with them, and they all leave a record of data. Others call it a behavioral residue, or organic data that you know, emerge from activities that we do on the web, or when shopping with a credit card, what have you. But if you look at sort of the discussion of computational social science, those kind of digital trace data certainly have taken a very prominent role in the last few years. And you know, these include everything, including the data from smartphone devices, and I'll talk a bit more about those in a moment. But when I say data from smartphone devices, I don't just mean geopositions, which is something people think of a lot, and certainly in the COVID context, something that was used a lot, either directly from the phones or aggregated through telephone service provider and the like. But there are other sensors on the phone too that can be used to collect data of interest to social scientists, starting with accelerometers. Many of you might use them to track your own step count. There are related sensors built in that can be used for research, all the way to a microphone or your heart rate sensor and the like, but also these near field devices or Bluetooth that allow the capturing of an interaction with other devices in the vicinity. So, you know, network studies have made use of these sensors in the more recent years. Another type of data that comes from these devices might not be immediately thought of when you think of smartphone data, but that's just basically the paradata, the behavioral traces of what you do with the smartphone. So what you see here are 10 sets of 3 sets of 10 people each over the course of 24 hours, and every app opening and closing is recorded here and color coded by app type with a different color. And you see them grouped because these data have been combined with survey data. So we do know whether the participants here are full-time, part-time, or employed or job seekers. And then you can look at the behavioral patterns of usage of certain apps grouped here, for example, by email and entertainment apps. And the pattern on the email apps is just like what we would expect with full-time employment having a heavier email use than job seekers. On the entertainment and gaming apps, though, as a, you know, at least in some of my roles, employer, I was somewhat surprised to see how little difference there is between these 3 groups. This was a sample of about 1,500 people in the US that had an app installed on their phone that tracked these behaviors. I will talk more about the methodology behind this when I talk about the IIB study where we use similar methodology. The benefits of these digital trace data is that they allow us to measure, or basically go back to the roots of social science, right? We do observational measures that are non-intrusive. They can evaluate moment and change behavior without additional burden. They are scalable in a way that surveys might not be. But the caveat with most of the studies we see is that they are highly selective samples that are willing to have these, willing to share their digital trace data. Footnote, we have done some research on sharing digital trace data during COVID to combat the COVID pandemic. Seems like there is clearly an opening towards that, but different story. The other exciting part on the new measurements is the use of platforms. So Naldi mentioned that earlier. We have been partnering with Facebook since April or March of last year to field regular surveys, but through the platform, basically draw a random sample from the Facebook population every day worldwide, stratified by a country and region within country, and invite them to a survey that's then taken on the Qualtrics platform, hosted by us at the University of Maryland for the international data, and by Carnegie Mellon University for the US data. And Facebook doesn't see the responses, but we do use, and this is why this is another example for the combination of data. We use Facebook platform data for the weighting. So both in the sampling and weighting process, Facebook uses the platform internal data to basically improve the quality of the resulting data. But the one thing we can't change, obviously, at least not with the data internally, is that the Facebook population is not the entire population. Some post-stratification can be done. Users of the microdata can certainly do a lot more post-stratification with the demographic variables we ask on the survey. What I should mention is this kind of vehicle is very different from surveys that are gaining in popularity these days, where you pay for advertisement so that an invitation to the survey appears in your news feed, right? So the COVID symptom survey appears on the top of the screen. The others appear in the news feed and are basically distributed by recommendation or algorithms, whereas in the case of the COVID survey, it is a true random sample of that population. I'm not going to talk about that, so I'm just using it as an example for those of you interested here, a quick overview of the kind of topics we cover in the survey, not just the symptoms, but also some vaccination questions and contact behavior and the like. In scale, this has certainly been something that I have not experienced before. By now, we have 52 million responses worldwide, and another, excluding the US, and another 20 million in the US. Graham Carlton, I think, is in the audience. He can tell me this feels like the largest survey certainly I have ever been involved in. But as we know, size is not everything, and the question is, like, can this somewhat odd population-based survey be of use, and what does the combination of data do to make them even more useful? Benefits of those platform data, just like the digital devices I mentioned earlier, certainly one advantage that we saw here is that they allow measurements at a very high frequency, in our case daily, and they are equally scalable. They also allow for fine-grained geographic measurements that we with surveys often have problems doing because of increased cost, and drilling into subgroup effects, small area estimation, both geographically or subgroups, in a way that we probably otherwise cannot. They also allow us in general, and that is what these paid advertisement surveys are often used for, access to very rare or hard to reach population, for which huge screener efforts would need to be made in your traditional survey setup. The big caveat, I mentioned it already, is that you're restricted to the population that is using the respective platform. And with that, you run a risk of a selective sample that may or may not be related to your outcome variable of interest and harm what you plan on doing. So this leads me to the second part of this talk, right? Now we have all these new data sources or old data sources used in a new way. but access and more willingness, and I think during the last year, even more willingness both from respondent and from the industry side to share the data for public good or for research related to the public good. But there is a lot of there are a lot of question marks still around the design that the kind of research questions that can be answered with these data. And I'd like to quote Roger Peng here, who spoke about design and data analysis once, and said one way to think about data analysis is to think about a product to be designed. Producing a useful product requires careful consideration of who will be using it. And I would say the same is true for data collection, or, thinking of Stanley Presser's talk in this context here, we're not really collecting either, right? We are designing a measurement and capturing that for a particular purpose. And so there's a lot of decision at place, and a lot of these decisions need to be tied back to what we are really trying to do. And if you think about what we as social scientists are trying to do, you could broadly classify that into three categories and say we are working on descriptive tasks, we are working on causal tasks, and we're working on prediction tasks. And I think the descriptive task is certainly the hardest one. To do proper inference, we do need positive and known selection probabilities, and that's why we're all somewhat squeamish with the data sources that from non-probability based samples, where we have no idea, what the selection characteristics are. Now, while for the descriptive task, we certainly are best off if both of these requirements are fulfilled, and couldn't help it but throw in a graph here that Charlie Meng presented at the Joint Program and Survey Methodology Distinguished Lecture this year, where he showed, if you look at the vaccination rates from January till May using the CDC benchmarks, that's that gray line here, and a sample survey done every 2 weeks, I believe, in 2 weeks from Ipsos, with about 1,000 cases and a lot of variables used for weighting, that if you just purely plug the census household pulse survey, which is a pure web survey with no alternative format to answer, or the COVID survey on the Facebook platform against it, then you see, while they all match each other in the pattern, the point estimate for these web surveys that have a different population to start with look quite different. Now, the census household pulse technically has the entire population, or the proper address base, but being able to answer a survey on the web certainly has a limitation in and of itself. However, these are the point estimates, right? And that doesn't mean that these other vehicles aren't useful for the other tasks that we do in the social sciences and do a lot, right? And that is looking at causal relationship or prediction, or comparing subgroups, comparing geographic region, comparing things over time. And there, as long as we don't distort the relationship, as long as we have data on everybody, the known selection probabilities might not be as key. And we do see, in fact, that these data collected via the Facebook platform have been quite instrumental in informing about the risk of in-person schooling, for example. In the US, this was a paper just published in Science very recently. And, acknowledging here that, yes, the Facebook population is not the entire population. However, if one compares what was done here, measures, different measures, you see them on the bottom here, mitigation measures reported by parents about their schools, related to reports of COVID-like illness, loss of taste and smell, and overall test, that in this correlational, or as the authors try to do, even establishing some causal effects, attempt, other qualities of the data are needed, and the combination of some of these data, or the survey-based data, with data from the outside, lead to fruitful insights. And the same would be true. I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but monitoring the vaccination rates in Germany, or predicting the risk of infection when we track the official reports to the survey reports. And in fact, in some cases, we know, like for example, in San Antonio, there were big spikes on the official reports, not because COVID changed so much, but because the reporting systems were very much delayed. And so, that too is not always the ground truth. Now, here in the audience, I take it we are all sophisticated users of data, and we know that no data source is probably the ground truth, and that there really is, a strong desire, push, need, if you will, for combining data sources. And if we visualize that, I like to use this illustration from a friend of mine, Ralph Kluber from Umlaut, who, since like if we think of the streets of Paris, being depicted, and that's the image of the world that I want to recreate, my big data sources or my alternative data sources, they might be quite blurry, not having all the precise measurements that I am planning. But if I do my precise sample survey, then I only have a snippet, and the trick really is to combine both of them with the proper estimation techniques, so that I have a combined data product that gets me forward. And this is not really new, right? We always have tried to use, for example, in rating procedures, information from the outside, from other data sources, to maybe adjust what we have in the survey data. And I mentioned that earlier in the case of the Facebook survey, two data sources are used, both the internal information on the platform to have post-stratification rates to account for the non-response bias that we might encounter, and post-stratification rates that are used for the US data from the US American Community Survey, and for the global data from the UN Population Division. As I said before, much more could be done on individual microdata projects. Now, let me move to a different way of combining the data, not just through weighting or small area estimation where you use different data sources, but to really use one source as a sampling frame to make sure you properly can understand and capture coverage problems and the like, and can make use of these novel digital trace data. So, quick detour on what is the research question that was behind this study. The effects of unemployment is something that the Institute for Employment Research obviously is very interested in, and has been for a long time. The sociologists among you that are into labor market research might know of this study from the 30s from Maria Yahuda and Paul Lazarsfeld, where the researchers visited a town in Austria and observed for several months what happens after a massive layoff. And they realized that the number of contacts people had, the social interaction, their whole behavior movement, everything slowed down, decreased, and it resulted in a disintegration of the daily structure, and that then inhibited many to take up employment and keep employment. And so the question, of course, is that still the case, right? As digitally connected as we all are, maybe the situation has changed, and we sort of attempted to do this study again. Now, the case study back then, was a case study. It had a small n, one town, inference what it was, right? We would assume some of the mechanisms hold, but we don't know for sure. For the longest time, we did surveys that were on the inference side great, but they lacked this problem of looking over a very long period of time what happens day to day, and lacked this possibility of fine-grained observational data, which combining these different data collection techniques is now possible. So we programmed an app that used many of the sensors that I explained before are present in smartphones. and issued every week survey questions on the device. And so here's a sneak peek to some of the results. This is the rhythm, the activities per hours per day, and the rhythm of payment divided for employed and unemployed people. You know, in the past, there always was sort of a big behavioral change depending on the time throughout the month. When people get their paychecks, they get more active, do more things, can pay for others. And on the right side, sort of metrics or measures for daily structure, you know, walking and still activities, if you will, during weekdays and weekends. We since then drilled down more, and it is very interesting to see that these behavioral changes affect men much more so than women. Women don't seem to, at least don't change their daily activity structure that much faced with unemployment, but men certainly do. But that's not the topic of this talk. What is interesting here, this study would have not been possible, or let's put it this way, I wouldn't be comfortable talking about any results from this study had it not been integrated in this framework of combining different data sources. So the digital device measurements coming from the app are combined with survey data from participants of a now, at least for some of the participants, almost 10-year running panel called PASS, which is a dual frame survey sampled out of households that receive welfare benefits and a random household sample of the resident population to get both those that are employed and self-employed and otherwise non-job seekers. And then they are paired with the Social Security claims record. So we have, you know, for everyone who is gainfully employed, beginning and end of their employment spell, as well as basic demographic information and their salary. And we have these data around, or these not just historically, but also going forward, right? So we can look what happens in the future. On the panel study, we had, in order to get good estimates of coverage problems, to first ask if people do own a smartphone and what type of smartphone they own, because this device study used Android phones. The other operating systems are either so rare that it wasn't economically feasible to program for them, or they wouldn't allow the sensor capturing that we planned on doing. And then from that, we sampled a set, and obviously not everyone will participate. This is a voluntary survey. But by having these background data, we can now assess the biases and adjust for the biases that we have for the non-participation through both of these. Here you see the smartphone ownership by age. Not surprisingly, it goes down with age. And but what was very encouraging for us to see, not just for age, but for other variables as well, that if you pick one operating system, picking Android operating system gives you a good representation. I'm hesitant to say that word, but at least on the observed characteristics, a good intake of all relevant subgroups with respect to our research topic here. We thought that there would be a big non-participation or very selective willingness to share data from the device. That was not the case. Those that said they would participate in the study also at a very high rate, almost 90%, allowed us to access their location information, access their interaction history, meaning texting and phone calls, not clear text, obviously, and not voice recordings, but a hashed version of the telephone number, who was called, how often, and the like. Characteristics of the social network, we had access to the address book and could ping names and against the name and the gender classifier, and then add characteristics of the network to the hashed phone numbers. Access to the activity data like the accelerometer and the geolocation that I mentioned before, as well as the smartphone app usage data. Now, again, we can ask, who uses these data, who can share, who would likely, be willing this. When we looked at network analyses on the app usage data, not everyone will be using certain apps. That is, of course, a caveat. We have, we see changes in trends over time. I'm curious to hear about that from India. But so this it, the combination of the data and the planning ahead of time. How can I design a combination of data sources so that I can assess the coverage error, so that I can assess the non-response error, so that I can look at measurement error pieces is key. And of course, before that comes the error awareness. And I think that is something any combined data product, any record linkage and whatnot, has to do and is doing, because the key question of every record linkage project or any combination of data is this a match? Are these units that I can combine? Is this, fair to classify that as a match or not? And, in a stylistic way depicted here on the left, this can be ultimately infinitely more complicated when you use, machine learning model and do this all probabilistically, but doesn't change the core fact that someone at the end has to decide whether this is a match or not. And this is actually a question that is everywhere, right, these days, or in many places. If you think of, doing in Google an image search, for example, the search term university professor, which I've done for several years, there's a name and then there's an image, and the question is this a match, right? And then you get fed back what has the highest probability of being a match as a picture. And for years, this was what you saw. They were in some elements, but not necessarily in the ones that are of interest to me. And then all of a sudden in 2019, this changed, and the most likely pictures that were considered to be a match were fed back to me this way with, almost equal proportion of males and females, right? Which of course is also not a match of the reality, but there's sort of an algorithmic decision going on what is a match and how we want to go forward. And maybe some of you were part of our conference on the value of science, its data product and use. Raid Ghani, who also is part of the Coleridge Initiative, commented there on sort of, the problems of biases in record linkage in the same way, and then, ultimately in any inferences that are drawn from deciding this is a match, in very much in the same way as we as survey methodologists would do. I failed to mention that he's a computer scientist, right? So that the success of these efforts on combining data, whether it's individual records, whether it's data from different sources for weighting purposes, or for combining them on the estimation technique, keyword small error estimation, we always have to take a deep look at the data quality. And this is not just the measurement error or coverage and non-response, but of course accuracy and timeliness play a role here too. In the case of these Google search data, the fact that the models are trained on historic data that don't reflect the current societal changes is of course a problem in this context, right? And then on top of that, we can have linkage error, type 1 and type 2 errors in the end. Any action that happens afterwards is subject to this. And without understanding the data generating processes properly, from these new measurements, from the different data sources, we run the risk that we get carried away with the potential of combining these data without, properly taking measures to mitigate that risk. And in the IRB smartphone study that I mentioned earlier, we did see by drilling deeper that, there were a lot of missing data. And the sources for these came either from software, from the hardware, from the user, or the context in which the data were collected. And so software, for example, there's a strong correlation on the gap in geodata measurement, depending on the version of the operating system installed on the phone, right? The older the operating system, the more gaps we had in the geo measurements, and same with battery levels and the like. And now the question always is, for a particular research question, is that a problem? Will that systematically change my results, or do I have information on everybody sufficiently so that I can do an imputation model? On the user side, we also saw measurement error in missing data in unexpected ways. Females, for example, tend to use their smartphones overall less than men, at least in our study in Germany. But more importantly, they don't carry it with them on their body as much, maybe a purse sitting somewhere and only being picked up back at the end of the workday, whereas men who have the phones in their pocket show more sort of micro movements within the same geolocation, right? So the complexity of analyzing the data can be quite large, but that's, I think, only a moment in time, because it's new for us and we don't know the data generating processes well enough. There were some very few users that installed additional apps that would distort the geolocation, basically change longitude and latitude. And then it quickly looked like as if you could travel within half an hour from Germany to, Africa. And that, raised the flag when we did our data quality checks, and obviously is a behavior that likely is motivated by privacy concerns. And I do want to end my talk with a few shout outs on that we have to keep that part in mind. The more we combine data, the higher the risk of violating privacy, but also violating sort of, ethical norms underlying the data generating processes or what have you. I like to cite or point to Helen Nissenbaum's contextual integrity framework in that context, because what she nicely emphasizes there, that we have to take into account or think about the appropriate flow of information. It's not that people per se want to keep their data private necessarily, but they have a certain expectation what happens with the data, who's using it, how does it flow. And if we violate that expectation and the norm, then we get the friction, right? And if you wonder what I mean with that, well, we're happy and we actually want our doctors, for example, to have a lot of transparency on our health conditions, but maybe not our employers, right? And so it does depend on who is the recipient, but also, in which context the data is collected. If a bouncer at a restaurant deciding whether you are allowed to enter or not looks at your ID card and sees your age, then that is an appropriate use in that moment. But having seen your address and showing up later on at night at your house is not, right? And so that's, even so the information is right there and present, that would be a violation of a contextual norm. It is clear that around the world we're struggling to get the data protection regulation in place that it allows the also unanticipated secondary use of the data, right, without violating these norms. But I think that there's room for improvement, and as much as we like GDPR, there's, in my opinion, much too much emphasis on informed consent. In part, I say that because people, when you ask them, they do express concern about sharing certain data, and we've done this in a lot of different surveys. Ask how concerned people are, how comfortable they are with sharing data of different sorts, and the GPS and smartphone data certainly fall in that. But I've also seen that, if we then experimentally vary in which context we ask them for the data sharing, for example, in the COVID-19 context, then all of a sudden the sharing and the combination of the data is much more suitable, or they're much more amenable to do so. We have to be careful though when we ask for data sharing and the request for sharing of data. We have done a lot of experiments where we played around simply with the placement and the wording of the questions for sharing data. For example, phrasing this as a gain frame, the data you're about to give us would be much more valuable if you would also allow us to combine them with these administrative records. Would you allow us to link them? And the gain loss framing, changed the positive responses by about 10%. And similarly, the placement from the front towards the back of the survey reduced the willingness to, or the consent to link the data by that amount. And, that's simple wording. I don't think these are stable attitudes of the respondents. And so as a researcher, we certainly have to be careful that we don't, how should I say that, streamline, massage our questions in a way that we get the highest response if that's not what people really want or what is appropriate. But it also shows that one can easily miss out on data if asked in the wrong way or at the wrong place. So with this, I want to summarize here and say that the new data are exciting, and both administrative data and the digital trace data provide great potential. I do think they can only be used when combined with, this potential can only be properly used when combined with other data sources to mitigate some of the inherent biases that they might have. But a lot of them have more value than we might think initially, because we do need to think hard. What is our inferential goal in that particular setting, and be clear about it? But within those limits, many of the data might be more useful than we might think if we have that high standard of point estimates. The key to success are designed data products that combine the strengths of the various sources. And it is certainly important to invest the time to understand the data generating mechanism. We have done a great job in understanding the mechanisms of survey data generation, and now I think we're all called upon to understand that process equally well for the administrative data, as well as alternative measures from digital devices. And as I mentioned early on when I showed you the form for the administrative data, some of these seems like they're records that get produced, but in between often are humans that fill out forms, and so many of our quote-unquote old survey knowledge applies here as well. Regardless of what data source we use, using the appropriate flow of information is certainly dear to my heart. So thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Kreuter. This was a fascinating presentation along with some very interesting pictures. I would like to now request Professor James to give some comments based on some of the experiences he has had in large data collection that IIPS undertakes.
Okay, thank you. And it's really a wonderful lecture and really quite a lot of learning. That was really the better part of it. I was actually sort of felt that I'm a student today, because the entire issues relating to new data sets and how it can be analyzed, how we can make sense of it. I think for us, it is more of everything was new for a person like me who always deal with only traditional data systems. So that's why actually perhaps my comments also will be primarily based on the traditional data system. Although I will try to talk something on the new data system which you have talked, but mostly on the traditional data, how actually, and also on linking different data sources. That's the most important aspect, because I think your conclusion is also very relevant. You have to really link, you have to connect together, otherwise we cannot really make much sense of even the new data systems which are available. I think that's also a good message for all of us to understand. So let me talk something on the Indian data system so that we will get some idea about it, because what really happens in India, because in a typical situation, the surveys which we are doing, and also even the new data system which we are getting into and getting sense out of it should have been primarily meant to establish causality. I think you have also mentioning that it is a purpose is primarily the causality. But in India, unfortunately, what happens, the surveys are really not primarily meant for causality, although we try to establish causality by different studies, but surveys are also sort of a substitute for administrative data here, because the point estimates become sort of an important aspects of any surveys in the country. Primarily because our administrative data system is very, very poor, because we really cannot make a good estimates of any parameter in the country, for especially in the health area. Even that is true in most of the areas in the country, because we have to really depend on the surveys. So naturally, we do undertake a national family health survey, not primarily to look at the causality or linkages, but really to estimate to what is really happening, what kind of immunization, how many people are taking vaccinations, and how many people are really going to the hospitals. All this information really comes from the routinely from in other countries from a administrative data, which we really depend on the survey data. Forget about even those kinds of information, even the simple things like the births and deaths also, we really depend on the surveys. That is the extent. So primarily because of that, the causality part is not really becomes so important when we really look at the purpose of the surveys. So that is why, when we think of linking, because earlier even in India there has been several discussions, why can't we link between surveys and administrative data? But there are several issues. One is administrative data itself is deficient, so you can't link, and primarily because we don't have one unique ID to link. That is definitely a major thing which we can perhaps develop in the country. That is, there are attempts towards that. That is only one part of it. But more importantly, the problem was that even if you link, finally, if your understanding is only for a point estimate, then why do you really want to link? Whether you can independently get that point estimates from either from the survey or administrative data. So you are really not making much advantage for such a linking. So the question, because since you were also mentioning on the privacy part of it, because this question also always arises in the country, because if you are trying to link these surveys with administrative data, obviously privacy becomes sort of a very important issue, because even in the surveys we have the issues, because we collect, when the NFHS surveys, we collect information on the HIV/AIDS prevalence. So we could not really give the identification even at the district level, because then it was considered that even district identifier can really throw up light on that, this district has more HIV/AIDS cases, though that can also lead to some discrimination of that district, which we need to avoid. So linking even at the geographical level becomes so difficult because of this several reasons. So forget about linking at the individual level. Individual level linking is substantially a different exercise, which is extremely difficult in the country. So that is really the problem. So many of the surveys will have that issue, because we may have information on the infectious diseases, we may have information on that particular diseases, then there can be an issue whether this geography is a disadvantage in terms of this. So will there be a discrimination against those areas? So that was another perhaps major issues. Now, we provide geographical coordinates, GPS coordinates we provide in many surveys, but we do it in NFHS, etc. We don't give the precise coordinate. We give it in a very 5 kilometers radius, so that people won't be able to understand or pick up exactly the point, but they can only get a regional understanding of it, or a sort of a larger geographical understanding rather than a precise locations. That's how we used to be able to manage it. Now, let me also come to the new data sets. That was most exciting part of your presentation. I think I could really learn. I was really fascinated by the fact that, the participation rate is relatively very high. 80 to 90% participation rate is, even in surveys, we get only 90%. So if one can get 80 to 90% of the participation through a smartphone survey, I think that is really encouraging and fascinating. I'm not very sure in India we are that much successful. I think NCAER may have better idea on it, but I know that even during the COVID times, there has been several attempts in the country especially not only to the general public, but to the selected health providers like ANMs, or we call here as the health workers. So there has been some attempt to conduct surveys among them. For them, the mobile number is easily available, cell number is easily available. And even then it is found that it is only 50 to 60%, not even up to 90%. So even when a selected population of health workers was working with the government, even then the proportion who was participating was much less in this country. So I'm really fascinated that in the future, perhaps we have a brighter chance on going.
I need to jump here and clarify one thing. I might have talked too fast. So the 80-90% was the willingness to allow us to take these measures from the smartphone among those that participated. So we had similar rates that you described, probably 20% participation on the survey itself when they were invited, but we were surprised that the willingness to share those highly sensitive data was so high. So it's not the case that all of a sudden this is like the panacea and this kind of survey that brings you 80%. Just making sure you picked that up nicely. That
so it's only willingness.
Was
so
too
may
fast.
Not lead to,
yeah, that was my bad.
May not lead to the actual.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, that's I can understand. Yeah. The other one, I think you have also clearly told. I don't think that I need to repeat that, because the major concern is that because our concern is on the estimation part, the point estimates. Actually, for us, the standard errors and the confidence intervals and the precision of the estimates have become so critical for any of our surveys or even for administrative data. So unless we get that estimates, I think, because we cannot really place any confidence in our the survey. So that is why we really not often averse to using these kinds of data for any estimates. That is because our primary aim is really to get first information and then really look at the causality part, which is the latter part of the story. Otherwise, I really enjoyed your talk. I think I have nothing really much to add. I'm sure these new data sets will become prominent in India because India being a software hub now, I think there has been many large companies are really widely using these methods and really to understand their business prospects as well as on various aspects they use. But being a demographer and in the health field, we really towards backward in the using of this modern type of data. But I'm sure my follower, who is the discussant, who is an economist, will maybe have a better idea on how to really utilize this data. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, James. I was actually thinking, listening to you, that if we are thinking over a longer period of linkage issues, there are two things I think we need to put in place in India. One is that any administrative data today can't be linked very easily because the geographic identifiers are not the same. Census village, revenue village, this, that. Government has actually put in place a local area directory, which perhaps should be included in all data collection so that we can do the linkages. Second thing is that if we are going to look at representativeness of any samples, it would be very useful, not just in India, but worldwide, if there were a few characteristics that were measured exactly the same way by all the surveys, all the data collection agencies, so that at least you can do some benchmarking of how representative your samples are. Okay? But I won't take too much time. I want to turn it over to Soumya Bhaduri. Soumya, please. Go ahead.
I have a small deck. Is it possible to share the screen and share that one?
Sure, I think that should be possible. So, did you try to share? Is it working?
Let me try.
Yeah.
Is it visible?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So, thank you, Professor Kreuter. It was a very, very useful and interesting talk. I'm hoping that in the wide contour that you have outlined and the broad canvas that you have portrayed, the unstructured data and macro analysis for India that I would focus on would find a nook. So my discussing points won't be as interesting. It would be a little dry, and I promise whenever NCER invites me next time, I will try to kind of produce slides that are more interesting, perhaps something more like infographic. So this one would focus on unstructured data for macro analysis. From macro surveillance point of view, I usually, whenever give a talk or something, I would begin with the quotation of Dr. Klein, which is very, very important for macro building, model building efforts for emerging economies, such as India, to continuously administer and update model. So what I would like to ideally do is touch upon issues that are related to unstructured data, that are related to topics of macroeconomic surveillance. And of course, looking at macroeconomic surveillance, the benchmark has to be reset and looked from an emerging market economies point of view. Because let's say we start with the first two papers. These first two papers are using conventional high frequency indicators, but they, instead of looking at standard benchmarks such as out of sample forecasting, tail risk assessment, it tries to look at turning points, because what matters for an emerging economy such as India is that unlike advanced economies, we don't have we have economic cycles which are better characterized as growth rate cycles of acceleration and slowdown around a time varying trend in GDP growth rather than business cycle of expansion and contraction. So long story short, what we mean is that there are sudden growth acceleration and sudden slowdown. We don't really have positive economic growth or negative economic growth. So if we have to understand this emerging market perspective, we have to relook into the template and redevise the benchmark that we set for India. So the first two paper tries to assess and relook into emerging market Indian perspective and how to assess the macro surveillance benchmark. The second bit looks at unconventional high frequency data such as night lights, Google mobility. These are some of the issues that we will also talk about, and what are the benefits from going from conventional high frequency to unconventional high frequency indicator. And then in the last 1 year, when some of our trusted high frequency indicators such as foreign tourist arrival, auto sales, if you remember in April, there was no data on it. If some of the high frequency conventional indicators fail, then the backup or the fallback options are with Nightlight and Google Mobility to trust upon, and at least to gauge what is happening to the economic activity in between quarterly data release so that it doesn't look like a black box. So to begin with, what are the challenges for a country like, yeah.
Sorry, 1 second. Could you shift to presenter mode?
Sorry.
On the bottom right side of your screen, there's a presenter mode right beside your zoom in scale. Bottom right.
Bottom right. Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yes.
I can do that.
Yes.
Yeah. I deliberately kept it because there were some slide notes, but okay, that's not a problem. So I will just like to kind of add what are the problems when we do macro analysis for a country like India. Of course, the first thing that we see is unavailability of long time series data. The second thing is we see that there are non-synchronous data, which would mean that at any point of time, we have data that are not evenly available. So we will have a rough or a jagged edge data structure. The second thing is there are data that are available in mixed frequency. Some of the data are annual in nature, some are quarterly, some are available in high frequency daily data. So how to meaningfully combine this mixed frequency data? Then there comes the problem with data revision that like we recently had a quarterly data release, but whenever there is a data release, past data would get revised. So how do we navigate through such frequency of data revision? And finally, there are in an emerging economy, there are rapid and intermittent structural changes, GST rollout. demonetization things happen. So your model and your indicator should be able to kind of quickly catch up with some of the structural changes. Just to give a sense of high frequency indicator, these are some of the trusted high frequency indicators that we use at the bank. And if I show you that if we're looking, like, let's say for reference month, August 2019, then for consumer good, the August data will be available in October. For if we look at non-oil, non-gold import for the same month, August, the data will be available in September. So as you can see, and even in October and September, the data will be available at different points of time. However, for macro surveillance, we cannot afford to wait for all the data to come for August. So we have to kind of meaningfully make use of whatever incremental data that is available and make best use of it to kind of come up with the best possible estimate at any given point of time. So long story short, what we want to do here is to understand the nature of JAG-based data and come up with measures that can handle such data structure that are more typical of emerging market economies. So I will not get into the dynamic factor model and all, but I would like to just provide that in our DFM specification, we take recourse to an algorithm which is called expectation maximization algorithm, EM algorithm, which is very useful because it helps us handle this JAG-based data structure. This is just like for a demo slide, which tries to show that how a single index dynamic factor can be kind of extracted, or a consensus trend can be extracted from high frequency indicators, and the panel on the right basically shows the factor loadings. Now comes the more important part, which is when we have already extracted a high frequency indicator and tracked economic activity from the conventional high frequency indicator, we try to see and compare the moments with the unconventional high frequency indicators such as nightlight. We see the red line is or the orange line is the luminosity index, and which kind of very closely moves or co-moves with the high frequency conventional indicators. So that gives us some sense of belief that even when we don't have conventional high frequency indicators in the face of an economic disruption or due to some kind of lag, we can always fall back on such luminosity index, mobility data to kind of gauge what's happening in between quarter. The second thing is this is an application of a nowcasting exercise where we try to kind of gauge that. So in India, there is a very unique problem, and not just in India, but in emerging economies. So we have a kind of a lag of official quarterly data release. So if we are at the October, November, December quarter, for that quarter, the actual official release will happen 8 weeks after the end of that reference quarter. So how do we kind of try to do a nowcast in such a scenario? So ideally what we try to do is try to do nowcast in 3 tranches. One is 2 months prior to the data release, which we call nowcast -2, 1 month prior to the data release, and 15 days prior to the official data release. What we observe is that when we are trying to do a 2 month prior to the data release, this unconventional high frequency indicators would be very relevant, because we don't have hard data such as automobile sales for that reference quarter 2 months prior to the data release. So when we are 2 months away from the official data release and we don't have conventional high frequency indicators, unconventional data such as nightlights play a very important role. However, as we progress closer to the data release, we start to have conventional high frequency indicators. By that time, the efficacy of unconventional indicators diminishes. So from a well-informed policy point of view, nightlights can actually play a very important role by helping gauge economic activity much ahead of the official data release. In here, we try to do a very interesting thing, which is, can nightlight track informal activity? Now, we kind of try to set up the system where we have a parsimonious autoregressive AR1 model augmented with current period high frequency indicators representing industry, and then non-conventional indicators representing this block NCB. Now, when the degree of formality, or if there is higher informal activity in a particular sector between industry and services, of course, services would have high informality, or informal activity would be higher in services. We observe that the role of non-conventional block is much, much more relevant. That gives or instills a sense of confidence that in sectors where informal activity could be higher, the non-conventional block, which in this case is based on night lights, on few other non-conventional indicator, plays a very important role. So that kind of is a very interesting finding, I would say. Finally, I would kind of move from night lights to Google mobility, and this is something there would shortly be a paper by my colleague Abhinav Narayanan and some others. This paper is not yet in public domain, but if you write to me after a month, I will be able to share the link of this paper. So in this paper, they are trying to kind of use the Google mobility data to track the overall mobility, the workplace and transit station mobility, retail, recreation parks, grocery and pharmacy index mobility. And what they find is that in the May of this year, the mobility actually fell to the level that was seen on last year actually. So basically Google mobility helps us track the mobility at a different sectoral level basically. In fact, based on that analysis, my colleagues tried to kind of understand from the reduced mobility, can any inference be drawn on consumption expenditure? And so basically in last year, they had this zonal restrictions, orange, red, green. And so they used that as an instrument to gauge how much of a reduced mobility can help us explain a fall in consumption. And based on their analysis, they see that on account of the reduced mobility, consumption could fall by at least 5.9%. So the idea is that when the conventional high frequency indicators are not there, when there is an economic disruption, then we can always take recourse to kind of high frequency indicators that are unconventional, such as Google mobility, night lights. And also I would kind of conclude by saying that the metric of macro surveillance has to be relooked and customized for emerging economies such as India. So I'll stop over here.
This is great, Soumya. Maybe I can respond to that just briefly, Sonaldo, if I may. I love what you said there at the end, that when your normal indicators are no longer available, right? And you sufficiently, you have looked into this and have a handle of the relationship between these alternative indicators and what you normally have, right? And then can adjust. And I think that's sort of the similar logic. I don't think we can, any or all of these alternative data sources are perfect, right? But we need to understand how do they relate to what we're interested in. And I remember the French also, they couldn't make use of, of their regular surveys for inflation indices and what have you. And then they quickly transitioned to using credit card records, knowing fully that that's not capturing everything either, but at least, changes in time. Just like the MIT price index, when Roberto Rigonon started doing that, using online data to measure changes in price. Well, the relative change in price in the online world is not all that different from the overall change in price, right? So at a level, you're totally off, right? Just like if you only look at Facebook users, you're off in the level, they might be more responsive, what have you. But the change over time might very well be exactly the same change over time you're interested in. And I think getting comfortable with sort of that, proxy, or with the use of proxies, I think is a challenge we face, because there is no formula with which you can do that. It very much depends on the context in which you do the research. Yeah, fascinating. Thank you for sharing that work. I do, James. I wanted to, based on what you said, I wanted to do one more plug for some literature here, because you mentioned, I thought that was very interesting, that you're concerned about privacy on a higher geographic levels, areas, and what have you. And I'm not sure if you are aware, this book came out, I think, last year, Linking Sensitive Data, from Peter Kirsten, Tilian Ranbaduk, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, and Rainer Schnell. And I find that, it's a big book. It says like everything you need to know on linking sensitive data, but pulled out nuggets here, 2 other reports or papers, one sort of a guiding document for the UK National Statistics Institute, and then the bottom one here, a paper that gets sort of at the ideas on how could you not mask, but how could you change geoposition sort of as a relative grid point so that you can amend them to a data set, and studies can be done that analyze neighborhood characteristics without revealing what the actual neighborhoods are, right? And so that kind of thinking is like, okay, the geolocation and proximity of people to each other is a super valuable resource. I mean, I was thrilled to hear that you as part of your normal production have that geocode in your data. And but I of course know how difficult it is then to share the data or use it, and how problematic the linkage can be. And so I this is not my area of expertise, but I follow with great interest how what techniques and ideas are being developed in order to make those data usable. And I do think linking on data around a geographic context or whatnot will hopefully do more harm than good. I heard you loud and clearly that there is a big risk in it doing harm, but I do think, or I do hope that for us researchers, at least, the intent is a different one. So thank you for that example too.
Sonal, you are muted.
Sorry. Soumya, do you have any comments? Your hand is up. And after that, we have several comments in the Q&A section that might be of general interest.
No, so sorry, that was by mistake. Sorry about that.
I had also seen in between a hand up by Alok Kar. I don't know. Dr. Kar, do you have any comments or questions? Okay, if you do at some point, just unmute yourself. But otherwise, I actually think that there is a very interesting question by Dr. S.K. Singh from IIPS that Frauke answered in the Q&A, but it is worth repeating. Dr. Singh, do you want to unmute yourself, or let me repeat it? He says, you are right in saying that platform-based surveys may have selection bias, resulting into higher chances of inclusion for those who having access to platform being used for data collection. Under this scenario, how does one develop weights to be used for different level estimates?
Yeah, and I love that question, and I'm glad, Sonal, that you're giving me the chance to bring that back to the panel here. It ties nicely to what we just discussed with the Google Trends data and it being a proxy, right? I mean, there too, we said it's clearly biased. It's also not capturing all mobility and what have you, but it probably trails nicely what we're interested in. And I think that with any of the platform data, and I'm curious to what my colleagues would answer to this question, since it applies to the Google and Nightlight analysis similarly. To me, really, it is, and I mean, we always said we need, as research or as survey methodologists, when we develop weights, ideally work with the researchers, know what their research question is, and then optimize the weights relative to what they want to do, right? Because there's no point in adjusting the weights to some variables that are not related to the mechanism that we are studying or the outcome variable, and then we just increase the variance without helping with the shifting the point estimate in the direction that we want. And that's true here too, right? So I think that it very much depends on what the data is used for. And to me, at least, the big advantage of going with the platforms is really on the small geographic units, on the temporal fine-grained scale, and sort of measuring things that we normally can't measure in that frequency at that scale, or what have you. And so then it depends on what the analysis is that you want to do, right? I think for the surveys we have done, I would say we over-indexed on the privacy concerns, right? I mean, we had the microdata is only available with data use agreements. They turned out to be very difficult for many institutions to sign because GDPR requirements. I mean, we had all global data together, meaning everything basically falls under GDPR. And that was difficult, you know, for some, which also means that then you can only use the API, the more aggregated data that is already weighted, but weighted sort of with the minimum denominator that we had, right? If you use the microdata, then you can use the individual level demographic variables, you can use the geographic information, you can link in information on, in our case, the developments around COVID that might make the quality of the data even better, right? So I think, it's, you know, coming back to the larger point of the question, I do think, you know, to the extent that we always should do it, but certainly now even more with these kind of data, even more than ever, is it necessary for the statistician to work so closely hand in hand with the substantive researchers to get the weighting right? And I don't see any other way, you know, that, yeah. But, you know, that might be different for the light analysis or the Google Trends analysis. So I'm going to mute.
Thank you. And we have hands raised from Santanu and then Sandeep Mitra.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Frauke, for this excellent presentation. So in this context of weighting, and as you mentioned earlier also, that microdata users, they can take advantage of the demographic variables present in the data and do some post-stratification adjustment, etc. But the problem with Facebook data is, I mean, so the, you know, the demographic questions are asked at the end of the survey. So what is happening, even if the respondent participated in most of the survey, most of the answered most of the questions, the demographic information is actually missing for more than 30% or so. So, but, and we don't have access to those demographics. I mean, we actually reached out to Facebook global team and requested them to, because they have that information, but as you know, they would not share that. So I mean, even if we try to do this adjustment, it's not possible because those are treated as non-response because they have already a survey weight. So you can't really treat them as non-response, but you can't do any more adjustment because you don't know their the gender or age group of the respondents. So that's a
Santanu, I feel so bad hearing you say that because I think, I mean, you know, proper questionnaire design, and if Stanley would be here and he probably would support that. It's like, yeah, we always tell people one should ask the demographic questions at the end, right? Because, you know, people are interested in taking the survey. You want to jump in and go right with the content and not, but there is this, you know, tension and trade-off. And I actually, it's funny that you mentioned that because I was, you know, just last week in a conversation with the team, seeing if we couldn't, you know, test this assumption in that really short survey where, you know, chances are, I mean, this guiding principle on they should be asked at the end, you know, comes from surveys in a very different context, right? And so it remains to be seen what would happen to the drop-off rates and the missing data rates. And so we have been discussing, could we, at least for a random subset, flip the order and see if that would be the better way to do that, because we rely so heavily on the demographic adjustment. And now hearing that from you, I will make a stronger push that maybe we do that. I mean, looks like we're not getting out of this COVID mess anytime soon either, so might as well improve the survey a little bit more on the way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sandeep Mitra, would you like to?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I was just inquiring, like, if you think of, let's say, experiments, hardcore research in the sense, like randomized control trial or this sort of thing, where you were just related to the outcome variables. So do you think this way of data collection using smartphones are really useful for such type of, because you have to have an experimental protocol done, you have to have something designed for the experiment. So do you think in such cases they should be a good fit?
Frauke, you're muted.
Yeah. Frauke, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but I think...
yeah, somehow it didn't take when I hit the unmute button. I couldn't hear the last part of your sentence. What did you say? Ask what was a good fit or not? I couldn't hear that.
Think of, let's say, hardcore researchers who undertake experiments, right? Yeah. So there you need to have experimental designs and the protocols in place. So it involves some sort of, though there are experimental bias as well, but, for such cases, do you think data collection using smartphones or some sort of remote sensors really, is useful, or what are the merits and demerits in that sense?
Yeah, so, I mean, thank you. This is actually the perfect question to get to this topic, and also to a question that we see here on the chat from Ankush. If you think of medical studies, right, they are quite comfortable doing experiments on completely non-random populations, right? Some volunteers that sign up for a clinical trial. And it's heavily controlled. You really know how the treatment is applied, and then you watch the outcomes. And I've seen sort of the same logic applied to data collected with smartphones or sensors, where, people get recruited into the study, and then, they get treatments administered to their phone, for example, reminding them to exercise, or, certain interventions with relate to food intake or what have you. And, to me, the device with which I collect the data is not what matters here. What matters here is if we think that the causal relationship we observe is the same in, basically, is there a homogeneous treatment effect? Is it the same effect for the population that I study than the population that I do not observe, right? And if I don't have certain parts of the population in my study that would show a very different treatment effect, and that discussion has been bubbling up a lot in the last 10, 15 years in the US, that they said, well, we have certain race and ethnic groups typically not in our clinical trials, and we're concerned because it could be, or there is suspicion that certain medication doesn't work in the same way, because there's, after all, some underlying genetic differences, what have you. And so yeah, there is a huge concern, right? If you do have to assume that there's a heterogeneous treatment effect, then it won't work. But that again requires this close collaboration with the substantive researchers to know whether this is the case or whether this is not the case, right? And what's the counterfactual, right? Not doing any of these experiments, or not collecting any data, or, waiting, when it comes to sort of high frequency data, waiting a year before you can do your next survey. Right? I mean, it's a trade-off. You can't score high on all quality measures, if you will, timeliness, accuracy, and so on. And depending on your research question, you might feel more comfortable giving in on one of them than on the others. But yes, absolutely. I mean, on the experimental part, I do think there is merit with these alternative data collection modes. But just like with traditional data collection, it depends on your hypotheses about the homogeneity of the treatment effects.
Thank you. This has been a great conversation, and by chat box questions, I think we could continue for a while, but in deference of the fact that it is pretty late in India, we will thank Professor Kreuter, James, Soumya for a wonderful discussion. I just have one question for you, Frauke. There are a couple of people who wrote in asking for some references. Is it okay if they email you?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll try to stay on for a few more minutes to ask the rest of the questions that are here in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. And good night, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you.